Before Gemini's two-man missions were possible, the United States had to master the technology required to place one man in Earth orbit. This was done in the Mercury program, which gave us the experience, the overall success, and even the occasional failures which paradoxically help establish the most effective pre-flight test procedures. The next step for the government industry team that proved out Mercury involved the even greater challenges of Gemini. The Gemini spacecraft is of a modular design that lends itself to the building block philosophy of testing. There are two major modules, the Reentry module and the Adapter module. The Reentry module is composed of three sections: the Rendezvous and Recovery section, the Reentry Control section, and the Cabin section. The Adapter module contains two sections, the Retrograde section and the Adapter Equipment section. Gemini will be our first space program to fly long-duration missions and to develop techniques of rendezvous and docking necessary for lunar landing. Gemini prepares the foundation for the advanced spaceflight missions to come.
If man could not withstand a zero-G environment for extended periods, 8 days on Gemini V, the length of a lunar mission, two things were obvious. Either our future flights would be limited, or gravity would have to be induced artificially in flight. Long duration was a test of the endurance of both spacecraft and crew. On the spacecraft side, Gemini V was powered by fuel cells for the first time. They replaced conventional batteries. This is important because batteries are inadequate for many future space missions at the power levels needed. Apollo, for example, will use similar fuel cells. Medical aspects of the flight were closely studied for such everyday matters as the ability to eat and sleep in space, and for longer-term results.
For veteran astronaut Gordon Cooper, whose 22-orbit flight ended Project Mercury, Gemini V is an extension of his exploration into longer and more advanced space flight. And, as command pilot of the 8-day Gemini V flight, he will record the world's longest space voyage. For astronaut Charles Conrad, the Gemini V mission will culminate 3 years of long, hard training. Since entering the space program in September of 1962, hours of classroom study, rigorous training in various parts of the world, exhaustive simulations day after day have qualified him for his first trip into space.
Spacecraft 5 will use two new onboard systems, a rendezvous radar and fuel cells.
A 76-pound box-like device called the Rendezvous Evaluation Pod will be carried on the Gemini V mission. Midway through the second revolution, explosive charges will eject the rendezvous pod, and data from the pod will be transmitted back to the Gemini V spacecraft. From this transmitted data, the astronauts can calculate the maneuvers necessary to dock in space, although there will be no docking during this flight.
The exercise will be useful in preparing for the full-scale rendezvous operations that will take place on the GT-6 mission.
Fuel cells will be aboard Gemini V and receive extensive testing as to their feasibility for onboard power.
The fuel cells, instead of batteries, will furnish primary electrical power for the spacecraft. Fuel cells combine hydrogen and oxygen reactants to generate power. They offer a weight advantage over batteries in long-duration flights and will be essential to the Apollo manned lunar flights and other extended missions.
In the visual acuity experiment, the astronauts will attempt to recognize large rectangular patterns arranged at two locations. At Carnarvon, Australia, these designs are made of white shell, and at Laredo, Texas, the rectangular layout is composed of styrofoam.
This pattern was composed of white rectangles, randomly oriented and laid out on plowed ground.
At various intervals, these patterns will be rearranged so as to give the astronauts a different set of rectangles to observe. This air-to-ground visual survey will provide information as to the ability of astronauts to pick out and identify certain ground areas or locations.
Their training also included flights in conventional aircraft. The astronauts were required to report by radio on the orientation of the various rectangles. During the actual Gemini spaceflight, the experiment is done in precisely the same way.
Another experiment will include photography. Pictures will be taken of space objects under different lighting and background conditions, and areas of Earth will be photographed for orientation purposes.
The next manned flight is Gemini V, an 8-day mission scheduled for launch in late summer. On June 1st, Spacecraft 5 was subjected to a series of manned altitude tests at the McDonnell plant in St. Louis. Gordon Cooper, Prime Crew Command Pilot, and Charles Conrad, Prime Crew Pilot, functioned as integral test components. The tests validated the performance of the environmental control system and other key systems during simulated orbital flight. The spacecraft met all performance criteria.
We have a telemetry problem with the spacecraft. We have no further information available on it at this moment.
This is Gemini Control, Houston. The erector's been put back up around the Titan II spacecraft to serve as an umbrella because there is thunder shower activity in the area. This is Gemini Control, Houston. Mission Director Christensen has just announced he's scrubbing the mission.
After a 2-day slip, the launch was rescheduled, and Cape support forces again took position.
Astronauts Gordon Cooper and Charles Conrad were launched from Cape Kennedy on August 21st. Primary objective was to accomplish an 8-day mission.
Gemini 5, Houston, Capcom on air to ground. How do you read?
Roger, Houston, Gemini 5, reading you loud and clear.
Same here. Have a nice trip and drive carefully.
Gemini 5 tanks monitor, how do you read?
Roger, tanks, reading you loud clear. Stony. Roger, Stony, reading you loud clear.
CM1TC, stage 1 fuel pre-valves coming open.
Roger.
CM1TC, we have a clear to launch from the reach.
Roger, DC.
Launch vehicle is transferring internal power. Minus 130. Stand by for engine kipling. Minus 1 minute. Minus 40 seconds. Stage 2 pre-valves coming open.
20 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6,
Ignition. Liftoff.
First, on the launch, liftoff was very smooth and positive. Neither one of us felt there was any doubt that we could tell the exact instant when liftoff occurred. Our entire trajectory was almost as perfect as a trajectory could be. I found personally that the Gemini launch vehicle was considerably smoother and more solid than the Atlas that I had ridden before, and I had thought the Atlas was a mighty good launch vehicle, but the Gemini launch vehicle was really a Cadillac. We did encounter the one small period of pogo, which was rather interesting to me since I had several years ago had been in on the pogo program out at the Ames Research Center, and it was rather a familiar feeling. I think this is one small thing that at the time it occurred caused us no problem at all. It's a small correction we want to correct out, but caused us no inconvenience or ill feelings whatsoever.
Roger, we stage.
Roger, on the stage.
Roger.
Gemini 5, your go. Your go.
Our insertion was as nearly perfect as one could possibly be. It conformed almost identical to the theoretical insertion parameters. We had a small communications dropout through this period of time, and which caused us absolutely no inconvenience, because we had an onboard computer which told us all the parameters we wanted to know, and we knew we were at a perfect insertion and that we were in great shape. And in fact, the first communication we had again with the ground, we were telling them what we were reading out. On to the first portion of the system's checkout, and to the very early portion then where we ejected the Rendezvous, or radar evaluation pod. The object is the radar evaluation pod, and the object nearer to us and slightly down and to the left is the blanket which ejected, which covered over, it was a thermal blanket which covered over the adapter section and was ejected out ahead of the rep itself. It's an interesting phenomenon in that there are no lights on this blanket. This blanket is a piece of material, mylar canvas type material. We are in the dark, but there is still enough sunlight from the setting sun that it lights the pod and the blanket just like molten gold. And we discovered this was the case in the day sides, that the sun lit the entire rep later on very brightly, like a metallic aircraft shining in the sun.
After a perfect launch in good orbit, problems developed in a new power supply system, and the mission seemed to be in trouble.
One of the cryogenic systems, the fuel cell oxygen, was decreasing rather rapidly in pressure. And not knowing what was causing this pressure decrease, whether it was in the regulation or whether we had sprung a leak somewhere in it, we had to make the decision of whether to continue or whether to power down until we could study and get all the ground inputs into what was the exact details of the problem. I made the decision that we should go through a power down, decrease this usage of it so we'd have a longer period of time to analyze what was wrong.
NASA Flight Director Christopher Kraft decided to continue the mission, evaluating the situation on a day-to-day basis. Department of Defense support and recovery forces throughout the world maintained an around-the-clock vigil should a sudden mission halt be called.
In spite of the drifting flight and the limited control we had available through periods of time, we succeeded in accomplishing a fair percentage of everything that we had set out to try to do. At the Merritt Island complex down in Florida, we succeeded in having one beautiful pass on it in which we locked out with our onboard radar a great number of miles out, several hundred miles out, and read out radar and computer data all the way in, all the way across the complex, and way on out into the Atlantic on the other side.
Back in GT3 and GT4, they had noticed some peculiar patterns on some of the antennas, so we did quite a few UHF tests, which were performed over Bermuda. We got quite a few photographs with our various cameras. This is a pretty representative photograph of geological details, and we had a great many of those, which came out very well. One of the bigger experiments that we worked on was the visibility experiment.
One of our experiments has been designed to answer a question which is quite important to manned spaceflight, namely, what exactly can an astronaut see from an orbiting spacecraft? First, we taught the astronauts to measure their own visual acuity during flight by means of a specially designed vision tester, which we built for the purposes of the experiment.
We did a lot of on-board vision testing with a small tester that we had in flight, and we found out there, they've looked at all that data, that there was absolutely no change in our vision throughout the flight, and there was no change at the end of the flight. And we completed the MSC-1 experiment on electrostatic charge, and this data apparently is correlated very well with the data from GT4. We succeeded in getting 5 Apollo landmark pictures. We were trying to collect a series of good space photographs of very prominent landmarks which can be used with the onboard Apollo navigation equipment. We did a cabin lighting survey. As you can imagine, passing in and out of daylight and in various attitudes, we had quite a varying set of light conditions within the cabin. And as an aid to improving cabin lighting and cockpit design, we've been gathered data in flight. I think this is probably the first time that was done. I might add that the cabin lighting in the spacecraft, of which we had both white and red lighting, we used both means to light the interior depending on what we were doing, and it worked very well.
This is NBC News, the flight of Gemini 5.
This is CKSN's coverage of Gemini at T plus 106 hours and 55 minutes.
Yes, I think it was pretty much like we'd anticipated. There had been a great deal of conjecture whether we'd be able to see them or not. I think here again it still is somewhat a matter of contrast and whether you have cloud cover, how the weather is, and so on. We did manage to see the first one very well, and I think tracked it fairly readily there.
We completed as the S1 experiment, and we had an opportunity to talk with that experimenter yesterday, and he is also in the process of evaluating the data. But it looks like we succeeded in getting good pictures of the Zodiacal light and possibly some pictures of the Gegenschein.
Cooper and Conrad continuing to streak around the globe at 5 miles a second, now well past the midpoint of their 8-day Gemini 5 mission.
Astronauts L. Gordon Cooper and Charles Pete Conrad are piloting their Gemini 5 spacecraft into the 69th revolution around Earth, headed for the world's manned space-time record, 7.5 orbits away.
Say again?
Is it?
92-1 is the orbit you have to go for.
Yeah, I just gave you.
Oh, okay. You were cutting out and I couldn't read you very well.
Oh, okay.
The flight director would like to speak to you for just a moment. Good morning, Gordo.
Yes, how are you?
How does it feel for the United States to be the new record holder?
At last, huh?
Roger. Congratulations.
We could succeed in taking both S7, which was the cloud top spectrometer photographs of storms, and we succeeded in getting 8 series of pictures for the Weather Bureau, and you may not know that these series were coordinated with aircraft in the vicinity of where we took the pictures so that they could get the same data down there on the clouds and correlate our space-taken pictures with the airborne pictures.
Go for the full amount of 8 days as was scheduled earlier.
I'd like to add one thing in there just for your information. When we first powered up this morning, after having been drifting for quite a while, all the thrusters were exceedingly sluggish, and we saw great globs of liquid coming out of them drifting by us when we were firing them in pulse mode.
Roger. That's interesting, isn't it?
And I went to direct to see if we could clear them out, and it did seem to, and we were getting big globules of liquid going by us, but they cleared out.
Okay. We were wondering about a drop in fuel here, and that might have been where we lost some of it.
It could be. Well, in doing that last tracking experiment, we were having great difficulty getting on the radar test there. We were having quite a bit of trouble holding our attitude, and finally we were having to go to direct to get platform aligned, and then we were fiddling around trying to find which thruster it was giving us the problem.
Roger.
Yeah, well, another thing was we do get these tumbling rates pretty high out of the venting hydrogen. So when we first started aligning the platform, we apparently had intermittent operation on number 7, and we'd attribute the fact that we'd start drifting off to the fact that the hydrogen tank was venting. And then we finally got smart after a while and decided to look at something.
Roger.
Here's Cape Rear.
There's Cape Rear, which was a double picture. It's an Apollo landmark, which was another experiment we had on. And to the left, you'll see the start of a very interesting cloud formation that we got for the weather people, which the complete picture of the cyclonic formation is on the other picture. On the 7th day, we gave Mr. Kraft a report as we passed over the recovery area on the location of that storm, which later caused us to come into a different recovery area than planned, 1 orbit early. And we watched that storm for the full 8 days and have some very interesting photographs of it. We succeeded in getting some of the first pictures of Australia in the daylight. The daylight conditions were within 2 hours of sunset, and I'm sure on GT7 they'll get some better photographs down there in Australia, but we did get the first ones that were ever made in the daytime. We also succeeded in getting some very good geological photographs of Baja California. We wanted to get some geological photographs of central Mexico, and unfortunately the whole 8 days we had at least 5 to 8 tenths cloud coverage down there, and we succeeded in getting a couple, but not as many as we had liked to have gotten.
And we went through a careful platform alignment for 1.5 revolutions and fired the retros in the middle of the night. We had a night reentry. Then we started the reentry at night, and we're perhaps halfway, a third to halfway through the reentry before we crossed the terminator and could see anything light on the ground. At this period of time, we were inverted in full lift flight. And I think the first location we saw on the ground was White Sands in New Mexico. And we had fired retros out east of Hawaii. I might say that the reentry, we had decided we would do a computer reentry if the computer was functioning properly, and it was by all the checks that we ran on it previous to starting the reentry. And we fired the retros. The attitude seemed to be held very well, and all of the data on board showed that we were that we'd had very nominal decelerations from the retros themselves, and the entire latter phase of the reentry were extremely stable, and we had no oscillations or movements on the drogue other than very small, low amplitude ones. And at the time then put the main chute out at 10,000 feet, and it was a beautiful main chute. It came out in the reef, completely even and symmetrical, no rips or gouges on it, and de-reefed properly. We went to the landing attitude, and first I counted it down so we could brace for it, based on the GT3 team's experience of being thrown into the windshield. And we discovered that it was not a violent action when you go to the landing attitude, but it was one if you were not prepared for this whip action, it would tend to throw you into the wind or the windshield area. And went to landing attitude nominally. The touchdown was extremely soft. We didn't appear to even splash any water. We didn't go underwater or put up any water splash at all. Judging the main chute, and found that we were, in fact, I thought that we probably should go ahead and remove the suits as we had sort of planned on. Pete, in the meantime, brought both the fans back on and said it felt like we were really cool. We had everything pre-cooled down to a point that it was still very cool when we touched the water, and that he thought that we were going to be cool enough we'd just stay in our suits, so we tried it, and we were very cool and comfortable. And we heard all of the communications going on UHF. Unfortunately, none of ours were received right in the immediate recovery area. However, they dropped some swimmers with the flotation gear, and they put the flotation collar around the spacecraft. Our windows were clean enough that the swimmers came up to the windows and looked inside. We gave them a thumbs up, and they proceeded to put the flotation collar around. And as soon as they had it installed, although we felt we could have opened the hatch on my side if we so desired, still we had some very slight wave action, and we didn't want to risk getting any water inside the spacecraft at all, because it was very dry and neat and clean, and we wanted to keep it that way. And I might add, very well stowed. We had everything stowed very carefully. It took us several hours to do it, but it was stowed. And we knew every cubic centimeter of space on board. And when the flotation collar then was inflated around it, I opened my hatch, and we climbed out onto the nose of the spacecraft and out onto the flotation collar. And the recovery helicopter came around very shortly thereafter and picked us both up and took us to the carrier. I think that both of us felt extremely fine. I thought for a little bit that my legs were feeling awfully heavy when we were up in the recovery helicopter, and then I realized that I had 4 big suit pockets bulging with equipment which I hadn't removed, and they didn't feel nearly so heavy when I took all that equipment out. But we did feel fine, and we got off the helicopter onto the carrier and went through the various welcoming ceremonies. And in fact, I felt considerably better on this flight even than I had felt after the MA9 flight.
Mission complete. Proof of our growing space-age experience in meeting with unexpected situations in flight.
The mission provided the first evidence that man could function during prolonged spaceflight, and that the Gemini spacecraft was a valuable scientific platform capable of supporting even longer missions. The objective was achieved as planned.
Champlain proceeds at 30 knots, and 2 hours after taking the astronauts aboard, comes alongside the floating Gemini V. The capsule, with its priceless records, is carefully lifted aboard the carrier. The scorched heat shield shows the searing effects of reentry. The capsule began its descent north of Hawaii, ending off Bermuda. The astronauts come to take another look at their cramped little home in space. They, too, were to have rendezvoused with a satellite the Gemini itself put into space, but could not because of one of the power difficulties they experienced. This, however, was the only one of the 17 scientific experiments they planned that was not accomplished. 2 $1 bills are produced as evidence that flyers Cooper and Conrad, who received them before taking off, are really themselves and not interlopers who sneaked into the capsule in space. This certifies their record to the International Aeronautics Foundation. For their first meal after 8 days of capsule fare, the astronauts were allowed to eat almost anything they wanted. But after this, there will be 11 days of strict medical examination and diet. To astronauts Cooper and Conrad, it can be said, mission gloriously accomplished.
Useful results came from the scientific and technological experiments programmed for astronauts during manned space flights.
We have some data from the GT5 mission and some preliminary conclusions from those data. This figure shows that the visual performance of the astronaut before the mission was essentially identical with his performance throughout the mission. And this figure has a solid curve which represents the visual performance of the astronaut throughout the many experiments that were made before flight. If performance in space was the same as it was before the flight, then the threshold measurement obtained by his out-of-the-window observation of the ground patterns should fall on that line. And these 2 points obtained during the GT5 mission indicate just that.
Gemini V. The tiny spacecraft and its crew have set 5 world records. Through them, the United States has chalked up the longest flight in space, far topping Russian cosmonaut Valery Bykovsky's 119 hours of 2 years ago. It has amassed the greatest total of man-hours in space, nearly 640, as against the Russians' 507. This country can claim the longest multi-manned flight, the most revolutions around the Earth, and with its 9 to the Soviets' 8, the most manned flights in space.
The 8-day duration of the Gemini V, as you know, covers the length of time it takes to fly to the moon and return to Earth. There were some of us who weren't at all sure that man could fly for 8 days, particularly in as small a vessel as the Gemini. But the results obtained by this crew, I think, proves that man can do this and do it well.
Next scheduled is Gemini 6, which will be aloft only 2 days, but will try an all-important meeting and hooking up with an Agena rocket for 9 orbits.